Hello everybody, it's Justin with Shock Therapy again, and we're doing instructions for our dual rate spring kit on a Polaris RZR 900. This two-seat car behind me has got Fox shocks on it. We're about to show you how to install our kit. Some of the negative ride qualities in a factory 900 are rear bucking, bottoming out in the car. These are very common because the car is extremely short. It doesn't have the same travel numbers as some of the new 1000s. Our spring kit is going to cure both of these things. It'll stop a lot of the rear bucking in the car when you're going through larger whoops and jumps. It'll also help you to not bottom out the car in the biggest hits and jump landings. This spring kit is a relatively easy installation, so let's go take a look at what comes in the kit as well as some of the tools that are required to install it. So here on the left you see a complete spring kit from us for an XP 900. We recommend that you lay all the parts out on the bench in advance. Set them in order that you're going to install them. It makes the process a lot easier. Our XP 900 spring kit consists of 8 coil springs. These coil springs are marked as to whether they're the front upper, front lower, rear upper, or rear lower spring. Make sure that you follow the designations and install them accordingly. All the spring kits are different, and we change the spring rates according to the accessories and driving style that you have given us. The kit includes 4 black spring dividers, 8 billet aluminum spring adapters, 8 silent crossover rings, 2 of which are used per shock, and 4 silent crossover O-rings. Some of the tools that you need for this installation are open-end wrenches, starting with an 18, a 16, a 15, and 13 millimeter. In addition to those, you're going to need various ratchets and sockets in the same size with a few extensions. A standard screwdriver and hammer are also helpful when it comes to tightening up crossovers and loosening up preload nuts. Now, a tape measure is definitely needed, but power tools are just something that's going to help you out. Another thing that you really want to make sure that you have is a good spring compressor and a Pro Eagle jack so you can jack the car up and do this installation. Now that you're familiar with all of the parts that are coming in the kit as well as all the tools that are needed to install it, let's go ahead and put this kit on. Step 1 in the installation is to jack the front of the car up. Make sure that you jack the car up to the point where the tires are just barely off the ground. Next, remove the lower shock bolts. It's much easier to use your toes by sliding them underneath the tire and lifting the suspension up and down as you remove the hardware. After that, remove the upper shock bolts and remove the shocks, taking them over to the spring compressor. You don't have to track the shocks left or right. They're not side specific, so if you mix them up, you're okay. Next, install the shock in the spring compressor and begin by lowering the bump stop on the shock shaft down from the lower spring retainer about 2 inches. This will allow you to remove the lower spring retainer once you compress the spring. With the spring compressed, remove the lower spring retainer. Now remove the stock spring and place it on the bench. Next, grab the hammer and screwdriver and break the preload collars loose. They're just jammed together. Now you can remove the shock and place it on the bench so that we can take measurements for the locations of the crossover rings and preload nuts. Now you can repeat these steps on the other side.
Ooh, so pretty.
With the shock on the bench, it's time to set the preload collars to 3.5 inches to the bottom of the preload collar where the spring contacts the collar. The spring isolators are installed against the bottom of the preload nuts. Your measurement is taken from the bottom of the bridge to the bottom of the preload collars with the isolator installed. With the preload collars and isolator installed at 3.5 inches, you can grab the crossover rings for this shock and install them. They are installed with the flat surface of the crossover rings touching each other. This allows you to have the recessed groove of the crossover ring facing the bottom and the top of the shock, which allows you to install the O-ring in this groove. Now you can thread the crossovers onto the shock body, setting them to 7.5 inches. The 7.5-inch measurement is taken from the bridge of the shock to the bottom of the crossover rings. The bottom of the crossover is facing the shaft of the shock. It's also the same place you install the O-ring. Now you can repeat the same measurement process on the other shock for the crossover and also preload nuts. Next, install the shock back into the spring compressor and get ready to install the new springs. As you grab the front springs, make sure that you check that they are marked front upper and front lower. Install the front upper spring first. Next, install the black plastic spring divider with the long end facing the shaft of the shock. Now install the lower spring for the front. Pay attention to where the springs touch the plastic divider. The spring ends must line up where they touch the divider on opposite sides. You do not want the spring ends to line up where they are touching each other at the same side. This will allow the divider to sit as straight as possible and keep the springs from bowing when they're compressed. With the springs lined up properly on the spring divider, go ahead and compress the system until you can get the lower spring perch installed on the end of the shock shaft. As you install the lower spring perch, make sure that you grab the billet aluminum spring adapter supplied in the kit. This aluminum adapter installs on the spring first, centering up with its adapter lip, and then the spring perch installs above it, centering the system on the head of the shock. Release the springs slowly, making sure that you don't hurt yourself as the springs release their tension. With the springs installed and spring perch in place, release the shock and take it to the front of the vehicle. Get ready for installation. Repeat this same process for the other shock. Next, install the front shocks back on the vehicle, starting with the upper shock bolt hardware first. You can leave the hardware loose as you install the shock. Next, install the lower bolt in the shock through the lower control arm. Use the toes of your feet underneath the tire to lift the suspension up slightly to install the bolt. You can leave the hardware loose. With the shocks installed but the hardware left loose, go ahead and lower the front end back on the ground. There's no need to settle it. Go ahead and proceed to the back of the car and jack the car up to where the tires are just barely off the ground. Next, remove the rear shock, starting with the lower shock bolts. Using your toes underneath the tire, raise the tire slightly as you pull the lower shock bolt out. Remove the upper shock bolts and remove the shocks from the car. Install the rear shock into the spring compressor. Lower the bump stop 2 or 3 inches to make it easy to remove the lower spring perch. Compress the factory spring enough to remove the lower spring perch with the rock guard attached. Slowly remove the factory spring. In addition to the factory mainspring is an upper tender spring. This will not be used in the new kit. Now with the screwdriver and hammer, break the factory preload collars loose. Now remove the shock, place it on the workbench, and get ready to set the preload collar and crossover ring height. You can repeat the process on the other shock. With the shock on the bench, set the preload collars to 2 1/4 inches from the bottom of the upper bridge. This measurement is taken all the way down to the bottom of the preload collars where you are installing spring isolator that is supplied in the kit. Install the isolator and with a tape measure, check your measurement of 2¼ inches from the bottom of the black bridge to the bottom of the preload collars with the isolator installed. Now, grab the crossover rings supplied in the kit to install them on the rear shock. Make sure, just as in the front shocks, that the crossover rings are installed with the flat surface on each crossover touching each other, leaving the recessed O-ring groove ready for the O-ring to be installed facing the bottom of the shock. Thread the crossover rings onto the shock body and grab the tape measure to measure the crossover ring height. The measurement for the crossover ring height is 6 inches. This is also taken from the bottom of the bridge, measured to the very bottom of the crossover rings where the orange O-ring installs. Once this measurement is set, you can install the O-ring on the bottom of the crossover rings. This O-ring is designed to silence the contact between the black divider and the crossover rings, so you don't have any noise. You can repeat the process on the other shock. Install the rear shock in the coil spring compressor and get ready to install the spring kit. Install the upper rear spring first. Check the spring for the markings on top that mark it as the upper rear. Next, install the black divider with the long end facing the shaft. Next, install the lower rear spring with the ends of the spring landing on the black divider on the opposite side of the end of the upper spring. Next, compress the spring system enough to where you can install the lower spring perch with the rock guard. First, grab the billet aluminum spring adapter with the lip of the adapter installed touching the coil spring. Next, grab the factory lower spring perch with the rock guard attached and install on the adapter. Release tension on the spring system while you guide the adapter and the lower spring perch to line up perfectly with the lower end of the shock. Now remove the shock and head to the rear of the car. Now, repeat the steps on the other shock. Now install the rear shocks on the car, starting with the upper shock bolt first. Once the shock bolt is installed, you can leave it loose. You can now install the lower shock bolts. Remember to leave those loose as well. Use your feet to lift the tire slightly in order to line up the lower shock bolt. Next, lower the back of the car onto the ground. Now it's time to settle the car. By driving the car back and forth using the brakes and throttle multiple times, settle the suspension to where it takes a set. Once you've done this a few times, come to a stop without hitting the brakes. Remain in the car while we measure the ride heights. With the driver remaining in the car at all times, measure the front ride height. This measurement is taken from the ground up to the lower control arm rear mount at the frame. The front measurement with stock tires should be right around 13 inches. With the front ride height checked, you can now go to the rear. Check this from the ground to the bottom of the frame, dead center between the radius rods. The rear measurement should be about 12.5 inches with a stock tire. With the ride height set, it's time to check the gap between the crossover ring and the plastic divider. In the front of the car, we like to see 1 inch of gap between the bottom of the crossover ring at the orange O-ring to the top of the black spring divider. If this is not 1 inch, lower the crossover to bring it down to 1 or raise it to bring it up to 1. In the rear of the car, we're looking for about a 2-inch gap between the bottom of the crossover ring and the top of the black plastic divider. It's now time to tighten both of these systems. Jam the crossovers together with a screwdriver and hammer, just like you did with the preload collars in the beginning of this video. Also, jam the preload collars together to lock your ride height in place. It's now okay to tighten all the shock hardware. Now that you have the spring kit installed and you've checked all the ride heights, luckily for us, our ride heights were set very close to being spot on and we didn't have to adjust it again. But the reason that we ask you to leave all the hardware loose on the shock is so that you could take the shock back off the car to adjust the ride height easily if you needed to. Ride heights are a moving target. Everybody's car is different, and every spring kit that we sell is tailored to your car and accessories. We do the best that we can to nail it, but it's about a 50-50 guess if we're going to get the ride height spot on. If in your case, when you install the kit, the car sits a little bit low, you're going to raise the system to the ride heights that we ask you to do. If the kit sits a little bit high, you're going to lower the system to bring it to the ride heights that we're asking you to set. Rule of thumb for preload nut adjustment is about a 2-to-1 ratio. So in the front of the car, if the car sat an inch too high, you would raise the preload collars by 1/2 inch, which would lower the car 1 inch. This way you can measure the car, take the shock off the car, adjust it on the spring compressor very easily and quickly, one time, install it back on the car, drive the car around, check it, and probably nail your ride height. Another thing to consider with our spring kit is that all the springs are brand new, which means they're going to take a set over the next 200 to 300 miles. So, set your ride heights according to what we ask, which on this car is 12.5 inch in the rear and 13 inch in the front with the driver in the car. Drive the car for 100 to 300 miles. Check the ride height throughout that time and you'll find the springs settle about 1/2 inch to 1 inch max. Once they do this, or at least once you reach the 300-mile range, raise the car back up. This is the only time the springs will settle, one time over their lifetime. From this point on, you won't have to adjust it again. With the proper ride height and the crossover ring set to the correct height, the first process in adjusting your system when you drive the car is to adjust the compression clicker on the shock. These Fox shocks on this car have a blue compression knob that has 20 clicks from soft to hard. Different shocks might have a different clicker with more or less clicks, but the process is the same. The first thing you do is drive the car, set it all the way soft with the clickers all the way to the left or loose. This will be the softest, most plush ride you can possibly get, but it is also easy for you to bottom the car out. If you find that you can bottom the car out easily, for instance, dropping it off into a wash and come out the other side, dragging the skid plate of the car as you do, stop. Put 3 or 4 clicks to the right in the rear shocks only, if that's the one that's bottoming out. Turn around and drive it again. If it doesn't bottom out after you put those clicks in, leave it alone. That way you have the softest ride possible without bottoming the car out for the terrain that you drive and the way that you drive. If the front of the car is something that you can bottom out easily, adjust it exactly the same way, a couple clicks at a time until it doesn't bottom out. If you find that the compression clicker does not adjust enough to keep you from bottoming out, in other words, the clicker is all the way to the right and you can still bottom the car out, the next step in the process for adjustment is to lower the crossover ring on the spring kit. The crossovers control when the lower spring is engaged, and the lower spring is a heavier spring rate. So this can stop you from bottoming the car out, but we don't want you to adjust this first. This is the last thing that you should do in the process. If you're bottoming the car out with the compression clicker all the way bottomed out, lower the crossover rings 1/4 inch at a time. Drive the car after every adjustment. You know that you've added too much crossover ring by lowering it too far if the car lands from a jump or a bottom out G out and bucks immediately after. As soon as the car starts to buck, you want to take the crossover ring and raise it back up to the previous adjustment that you had. Once you've found this happy spot, the only adjustments you should be making is the compression knob on the shock. With the spring kit installed and all the adjustments set correctly, what you should realize and feel from this spring kit is a much more plush ride in the mid-stroke when you're sitting on the combined spring rate, which is a much lighter, plusher, smoother system. The chop and chatter and small rocks should go away. Also, without sacrificing any plush ride, the spring kit will give you much more resistance in bottom out, G out, and jump landing situations where you need it the most. In other words, the best in both worlds, plush and stiffer where you need it. If you love the advantage and the improvement that the spring kit gives your car, there's more that you could do as well. Our internal shock modifications, or ride improvement system, will modify everything on the inside of the shock to double the improvement that the spring kit gives you in both plush, ride quality, and G-out resistance. It's the perfect marriage between shock internals and spring kit. We really hope that this spring kit installation video helped you throughout the process. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below or call the shop and we'll answer them as soon as we possibly can. For more UTV videos and content, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Shock Therapy LLC. Testing sound. Does Chase actually have new batteries in his stuff? He's gonna catch everything. What's up, girl? What's your number?